Just some points of introduction as we move into Colson Whitehead's zombie novel Zone 1. I want to kind of think here about the deadness of the city and the vanished order that is part of Mark Spitz's tale in Whitehead's novel. So as you read, think about the layers of interpretation that you can engage this novel on. Is this a playful horror story in some ways? Is it a not so playful horror story? Is it an allegorical vision of the direction of the United States of America, or of kind of a wider sense of empire in the early 21st century? As you read, think through the interpretive levels that make each of those kind of readings possible here. The novel works within a reconfigured space and time, as our previous apocalyptic novel did. It's another future New York, but it is a New York that is also devoid of future in some ways. That it's a city that's been marked by death and the rise of zombies in the city. A nation that is, for whatever reason, fallen into this zombie apocalypse. And Whitehead narrates the story of Mark Spitz, playfully named for the Olympic swimmer from the 1972 Olympics, as his hero here, of sorts, right? That Spitz is trying to find his way through this new zombified world. And race is an aspect of Spitz's character. He is African American, and so there's kind of a playful element to this, in that, typically in a horror film, it's the, as the cliche goes, it's the black guy who dies first. But Spitz is a survivor in this novel. So how does he work as a hero as you read and interpret this work? In his identity, there are moments where he begins to almost identify with the zombies themselves. Every so often, it says on page 19, he recognizes something in these monsters. He looks into their eyes and sees himself in some ways, and feels that they deserved release. And how does he balance his own sense of survival and need for survival? And he lives with a strong sense of dislocation, of course, right? Who is his family now? His family, of course, has become zombies as well, and so how does he attach himself to others or find a place for life in this new United States, this new America, this new American Phoenix, as it's described at various points in the narration? That new nation is kind of like trying to reassemble civilization bit by bit, but it's very tentative and uncertain. There was a sense of order that's being developed in that coming reborn world that they crawled toward, as Whitehead notes on page 29. So that sense of, is that order real, or is that order only an illusion that Spitz is trying to inhabit in the novel? On some levels, he has a sense that there is some order that's developing. That on page 111, Whitehead notes that Mark had to admit that he preferred things now that Buffalo was in charge, replicating the old governmental structures. In Reconstruction, you knew where you stood. Mark's happy because there's the order of 3 square meals a day. But what is happening in that Reconstruction, and how does Whitehead mean that term, reimagining the sense of the South as it reestablishes its own kind of racialized order after the American Civil War? What does Whitehead mean by that term, Reconstruction? How do you think about it in your interpretation of this novel? Mark also attaches himself to the lieutenant, a figure who kind of introduces him to Zone 1 and his mission in it. In their initial conversation, the lieutenant says, "But who has a family anymore? Everybody's dead. Now we're all batshit killing machines. What we have here in Zone 1 is not a suicide mission, just a bunch of stragglers. Welcome to the team." And so Mark attaches himself to this figure and finds a sense of place in his relationship with the lieutenant. You also think about this in terms of it being just a pure zombie film, right? Or as a rewrite of those classic George Romero films, Night of the Living Dead, etc. And how do you think about the zombies as characters within this work? Typically, writers define characters by their wants. And so if you think about the zombie as a character, it's hunger, it's unsatiated hunger. How is that a want here? And you get a grisly scene on pages 87 and 88 when Mark walks in on his mother devouring his father, and how that sets him on the run as he realizes that the world is coming apart in this zombie apocalypse. As things develop, the zombies start to get kind of distinguished in Mark's eye. There are what they call standard issue scales, which are kind of more lower order zombies versus those who are what they call stragglers, who are constantly, as Whitehead notes on page 60, reenacting a primal moment of expectation, much like the fevered in Ling Ma's Severance, where there are figures that are going through kind of old routines and old rituals. That's what the stragglers do, versus the scales, who are simply there to devour. They get distinguished as well in terms of gender, right? Regular scales got referred to as its, and stragglers were awarded genders as people looked at them and then shot them down. The last night is a shared narrative that goes on throughout this novel, right? The characters each have their version of the last night before the horror descended, and so that becomes a kind of telling that story of the last night becomes a point of identification as you meet people throughout the novel. People have trouble naming what's actually happened in the horror, right? Sometimes it's called the ruin or the catastrophe, the great unraveling, the new circumstance, and characters will find new ways to kind of describe what it is that's happening. Or the origins of the apocalypse are kind of shrouded in uncertainty as well. As Whitehead notes on page 27, it's unsure whether the sickness was biological or metaphysical in the end, right? Is this a bodily disease that's passed on, or is there something that's more kind of spiritual about it in the end? Whatever it is, there's just pure disorder, right? There's no system anymore after the calamity. There's no order that's there, and no matter how the government tries to kind of reestablish spaces of order, the zombies, just seem to be overwhelming the system bit by bit. And so the question is, can Zone 1 hold out against the zombies throughout this novel? And there's a nice play in this novel between memory and what characters experience as rumor or quote-unquote history. They all have their last night stories, right? But then there are also these rumors or, histories that, are uncertain or that leave the characters kind of guessing or what's really going on. Like, as they'll speak about on page 52, after what happened on Air Force One on that night, or whatever the hell had happened in Birmingham. There are these rumors of unimaginable violence, and so that becomes part of the characters' navigation of the world. These rumored histories against what they know themselves in memory from what had happened on their last night of order. The place of New York City here is significant, of course, in the novel. Do you read this tenuous creature of a city, as Whitehead says, as a living city, or do you read it as a kind of a vast necropolis that's kind of been defined by the zombies? Mark notes in his near the beginning of the novel that pieces of citizens were on display in the windows. It's that kind of place. It's marked by blood. He remembered how things used to be, though, when he'd come into the city. The city, though, was a ghost ship on the last ocean at the rim of the world, a gorgeous and intricate delusion, Manhattan, and from crooked angles on overcast days, you saw it disintegrate. The city is always trying to hold together, but the city is always on the edge of disorder. And the new government here is trying to retake Manhattan as an ordered space. There's a sense of new order here that Mark buys into in his work as a sweeper. The provisional government of Buffalo was, quote, keen for the sweepers to record their demographic data so they keep track of the kills that they made and to try to figure out, how many zombies are there, and is there any order to how people have become zombies. So there's a statistical mix that's part of the order that's developing here. And does that statistical mix offer any hope? The lieutenant, sees Buffalo, the new government, as a springboard for order, but we always wonder how much he buys into that hoped for order in the end. As he says on between pages 118 and 121, Buffalo's attitude is let the sweepers do their thing, and then we'll fix that little glitch when we start on zone 2. We'll take it back barricade by barricade. And when he says that, do you believe that he believes it as he says it in the end? Versus Mark looking at that, looking beyond the city in some ways and thinking about that other territory beyond the wall that separates zone 1 from the areas that are controlled by zombies. The island was different. It felt like a city, as if order did not terminate at the electric fence but strode forth. So does that order move out into the nation? Is there a way of retaking this space and making it quote unquote ordered in the end? And Mark's story is one of being a member of Omega, a sweeper team that moves through the city to clear out the buildings one by one. They work the zone. They pop them and drop them, as it says in the novel. Although as they do, they know that they're changing bit by bit as they move through this space. They know they're being fundamentally altered, as Whitehead writes on 95, in their very cells, inducted into a different class of trauma than the rest of the survivors. Semper Fi. So it ends on the Marine Corps motto, right? But they are fully aware that there is a trauma that is taking over them, as much as the whatever disease this is that has, initiated the zombie apocalypse. And Mark notes that sense of trauma in his life at Fort Wonton, which is what they call the zone that's cleared, the Zone 1. Soldiers had what Mark had come to call the wasteland stare. Everyone was fucked up in their own way, and he recognizes this sense of uncertainty or anxiety that's present in all the soldiers that he meets, and in his team members as well. He recognizes that anyone with perfect posture was faking it, overcompensating for entrenched trauma. How much is Mark's trauma a part of who he is in this novel? Against that trauma, the lieutenant steps in as a character like someone out of an old war movie, that offers order, offers a possibility that life can be remade in the midst of this apocalyptic event. And Mark begins to attach himself to the lieutenant. On pages 98 and 99, you get a description of their work, where any structure under 20 stories was left to the sweeper teams, and that's against the ongoing working routine at the wall, where the zombies kind of every day move towards the wall, and the soldiers stationed along the wall fire machine guns into the zombies as they approach. As Fabio introduces Mark to it early on page 114, they usually come in 3 waves, the zombies do, kind of regular, so we call it breakfast, lunch, and dinner. That there is lunch. And so in the grimness of this apocalyptic event, we begin Whitehead's novel, and we'll look for a sense of order and life or death as the story goes forward.